we have to talk about the way that economics is taught. It's a theory that we teach at universities. It just assumes that we are heartless maximizers of our own utility. The textbooks in economics assume that consumption increases happiness, but we consume to increase social rank, social position, to join groups and stay within those groups once we've joined them. The happiness comes from being with others, not from the consumption itself. So we are social animals. That means that this kind of economics that we're teaching at most mainstream universities, it's not the right software for the hardware that we have.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you could support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far, and thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT Podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we are delighted to be joined today by our friend, economist and author of Modern Money Theory, A Simple Guide to the Monetary System, Dr. Dirk Entz. Thanks for joining us today, Dirk.
Thanks for having me.
So your latest book, Dirk, is aimed at policymakers, which is a great excuse for us to apply the MMT lens to the upcoming imminent UK general election and what's on offer. But just to set the table for anybody new here, why do we say MMT lens rather than MMT regime? And what makes that lens different from other economic perspectives?
Well, it's an MMT lens because it's really a way of seeing things differently. So it's not that we have found something new or that we want to have some kind of change to the monetary system that we're in favor of. It's just that we have recognized that the monopoly of the currency lies with the central bank, so with the Bank of England, and they are the only ones who can create pound sterling in that case. And as long as they work together with the British government, will make all its payments via the central bank. And that means that they can never run out of pound sterling. And if the central bank would not comply with whatever the Treasury wants, then of course the government can change the laws regarding the Treasury. That also goes for the Bank of England. So in 2020, I think it was under Boris Johnson that the British government asked the Bank of England to basically allow the government to create money on behalf of the government without issuing any gilts, without issuing any government bonds. And the Bank of England finally agreed after a little bit of back and forth over the weekend, but they agreed to create an account, which I think they said it's up to £40 billion, something like this. It was never used, but it was very clear to see for all that if the government wants to spend money, they can spend it.
And just to put a pin in this thing that comes up a lot, and we did a whole episode about this previously, and I'll link to that in the show notes. But when you say that the central bank is the monopoly issuer of pounds sterling in the UK, there'll be maybe somebody who's stumbled across us for the first time going, oh, actually, I heard that commercial banks create a lot of what we use as money, their commercial bank credit. How do we address that?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a difference between deposits at the central bank that are denominated in pound sterling. That's the kind of the real thing. So banks can swap their central bank deposits for cash, for example. When we borrow money from the bank, it's not really that we're borrowing money, but instead we are buying the promise to pay that the bank issues. So we have an account at our bank, and then when we borrow money from the bank, they just top up our account by, let's say, £10,000. And that's just a number in a computer system. So they create that number when they extend the loan. So you sign the loan contract and the bank says, okay, so here's £10,000 in your account. And that's a promise of payment. So we will pay you cash if you want. So when you walk to the ATM and you get your cash, you withdraw money, then we will make sure that this works. Or if you want to make a bank transfer because you're buying something over the internet or in a shop and you're paying with your card, then we will also make sure that the payment is made. But that's not money in the sense that you can use that for making payments to the state, for example. So that's only possible with central bank money. So the banks, they create their own money, if you want to call that money, but all of that money that is created has to be repaid. And that's, I think, a very important difference, that the money that the government spends, that circulates in the economy until it's used for tax payments. But you can have deficits for many years, and that those add up to the public debt. And that means that there's a lot of money in the economy created by the public sector. I just checked the numbers a couple of days ago for the United States. And in the United States, I think in 2023, the government created roughly 3 times as much money by net spending, so government spending minus taxation, compared to the new loans created by the banking system. And so that means that at least in the 2020s, I guess that on almost all of the countries, the governments now create more money than the banking system by extending loans.
So we could say the government spends money into existence when it spends, and it deletes money out of existence when it taxes. Additionally, you could think of commercial banks as adjuncts of government who are lending money into existence, something that we could use as money, lending money into existence as an agent of government. Does that sound fair enough?
Yeah, I mean, the banks, normally they have to be chartered, so you cannot just open up a bank. You need the government's acceptance. And that means that you also have some kind of specific task. So the banks normally are not there to speculate on real estate and make house prices go up. I mean, that's not their purpose. So they should have a public purpose as well. And if the banking system only works in that way, that they drive up real estate prices, for example, then the government should do something about it. I mean, the main idea, at least in our capitalist societies, was always that private banks would lend money to the entrepreneurs, and those would then buy machines and increase productivity. And that is what the banking system did in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. And then somehow, starting probably in the 1980s, roughly, the banking systems, because there was less demand from the companies, they switched more and more to financing real estate. And now a normal bank is more about financing real estate than about financing the productivity of the real economy.
So just bringing it to the election now, Patricia, this is like a bad time of year for people who understand the out money view, where it originates with the government and flows to the private sector rather than the other way around. But now we have politicians who are doubling down on this government as household view, that we can't do progressive policy X or progressive policy Y because we have to tighten our belts. But, Labour are saying the Conservatives have left us in a mess. And if it was the other way around, the Conservatives would be saying Labour have left us in a mess. And anyway, on that front, Patricia, you wrote on Twitter, dreaming of an election when both left and right don't elevate the rich as the most significant providers of public services. Tell us more about that.
Well, I think you and I have been doing the whole activism thing for at least a decade now. You probably more than me. But these are the same narratives that we've been hearing over and over every single election. And it seems to be getting much, much worse. But also it's quite disappointing that now you see other parties coming in. You're starting to feel something outside of the dichotomy of Labour, Conservatives forming, an opportunity to get in there and have an impact, far even more than the UKIP years. And yet the biggest hope for the left, who are the Greens, and there's quite a few MMTs within the Greens, we know some of them, and yet even the Greens, who have how many seats in Parliament? 1?
That sounds about right, but I could be wrong. I don't have the info in front of me.
No more than 5, if that. And not even they can bring themselves to challenge the establishment in any substantial way. All the parties seem to be driven, well, most of them seem to be driven mostly by how do we attract the moderate voter in the UK, rather than how do we solve the problems that we have now, and how do we present a unified vision of the future with those problems resolved. And the solutions may not be the standard mainstream solutions. They may be completely different ones. But it is quite depressing to see that the Greens shy away from being radical, and even more depressing to see that the Reform Party are kind of Obviously, as any demagogue might do, what they do is identify real problems and then present the wrong solutions. But they are talking about things that you feel like the left should have been talking about and propose their own solutions for it. And of course, that leaves an opportunity for the far right to take advantage of the big gaping hole the left is leaving. So that's quite depressing.
Yeah, I was going to throw that over to Dirk, actually, because to establish the stakes, you're in Berlin, Dirk, and in Europe, arguably, we are seeing this process of centrist politics and politicians who've been working for years now with this outdated, not fit for purpose economic paradigm, which is the government as household view. And because of that, they've not been able to deliver an economy that works for everyone. And as a result, we're seeing right-wing extremism gaining traction in Europe. Would you say that's a fair characterization of what's gone on given the recent EU elections?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we have this straitjacket, this fiscal straitjacket in the form of the Stability and Growth Pact, which says that the public deficit, so the difference between government spending and tax revenues, that cannot be larger than 3% of GDP. If it is considered to be excessive, and then the European Commission would come and cut down government spending. And the interesting thing about the European Union is that when we had the pandemic, all of that went out of the window. So the first thing that happened in terms of policy making was that in March 2020, the general escape clause of the Stability and Growth Pact was activated. And that meant the deficits did not apply anymore. And then the European Central Bank says, and we'll also buy up all the government bonds that the governments will have to issue because there will be bigger deficits because we have lockdowns and tax revenues are down.
Just to be clear, though, Dirk, bond issuance for currency issuing entities, they're issuing bonds to match the difference between tax receipts and spending rather than to fund the difference between tax receipts and spending. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's all going back to the regulations of the Eurozone. So theoretically, of course, the government could just have a negative number in their account at the central bank, and that would be it. But the law, so the Treaty on the Functioning of European Union says in Article 123 that the Eurosystem and the ECB are not allowed to finance directly the governments. And that means that they have to issue those bonds in order to bring back their accounts at the central bank to zero or to positive territory. That is why the Eurozone governments are issuing bonds. It has nothing to do with funding. So it's spending first and then basically filling the deficit with tax revenue, and what is left then is filled with bond revenue. So yes, what you said makes perfect sense. And we had that figured out in the European Union. And in 2021, Q3, GDP already was back at where it was in 2019. So about 2 years later. That's, of course, a big improvement on the response to the global financial crisis, which was done in the European Union using austerity policies, just like in the UK, and which was a complete disaster. So it comes as a bit of a surprise that the European Union has turned back to the old ideas of austerity politics and having deficit limits and such things, when getting rid of these rules during the pandemic worked wonderfully. So the employment rate of the European Union and the Eurozone has never been higher than in the last 2 years because the governments could spend lots of money. There were many countries with double-digit deficits in terms of fiscal deficit to GDP. So that was a good thing.
I noticed that you joked at the time, you get stability and growth when you turn the Stability and Growth Pact off.
Yeah. I mean, these are really fair weather rules. It's really in instability and shrinking pact. So yeah, it's so bad that, I mean, it really doesn't do anything in good economic times because then tax revenues are high. So the Stability and Growth Pact is supposed to bite in bad times when deficits are high. But every time that happens, they have to get rid of the Stability and Growth Pact, or they have to not enforce the rules. So the last time during the austerity politics, what they did in the European Union is they stopped to apply the rules. So if countries had a fiscal deficit that was supposedly excessive, then the European Commission just said, well, you better watch out or we'll come for you in the future. But they didn't force countries to cut government spending anymore. So I remember that in 2019, so the year before the pandemic, the European Commission had 10 excessive deficit procedures and 9 countries went unpunished. They only punished Romania. I don't know why, but that means they did not enforce the rules. And now we had a fiscal reform this year and the fiscal frame was reformed, but they didn't improve it in any way. So the national governments of the Eurozone are supposed to run surpluses to return the public debt to GDP ratio towards the 60% that they think is a good idea. But this is a really odd economy where you have government in a surplus position, and all of the governments in the Eurozone are supposed to be in a surplus position at the same time. But of course, you're asking then, who's going to have the deficit? I mean, the private sector, us, we're not going to have the deficit. Nobody can force us to. We don't need to borrow money. But then it would be the external sector. So it would mean that the Chinese and the United States, they would have to accept that the European exports are higher than European imports. But we have all these trade wars. We have higher tariffs now with EVs and everything. So I don't think that these kind of economic rules that we have in the Eurozone, they worked in the 1990s and 2000 and 2010, but they don't work anymore, I guess, in the 2020s with the situation that we now have with industrial policy in the United States, trying to build up their own old industries or the new industrial industries. I think it's not going to work. So it's been a disappointment. So yeah, the European Union definitely has a lesson to learn.
And coming over here to the UK, there's a lot of talk at the moment. The manifestos are coming out this week and have come out this week and last week. We get a lot of left-leaning commentary advocating a wealth tax and noting, I think correctly, that's a popular proposal with voters. And wealth taxes, given that we have this view about where money originates from, our problem with wealth tax advocacy is it always comes along with, yes, we're using this money that we're taking from people who, by our estimation, have too much, and we're going to use that to fund the public sphere in the areas where it needs funding. How should we view wealth taxes through the MMT lens? Patricia, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, wealth taxes. So obviously we are very pro wealth taxes, but probably for a very different reason than a lot of these lefties are.
Well, you know, in a way, we nearly all agree that, that we can tax wealth because the people at the very high end who own a lot of wealth own so much wealth that it's kind of toxic to democracy and they're able to control lots more things than they should be allowed to control in a democratic society. And so that's a very long-winded way of saying you should tax the ultra-rich because they're too rich, right? And we can all agree on that, right?
Yeah. The problem is the justification they're giving, because they're making this about funding public services. And they're suggesting that government works like a household, that if you want to spend £100 on something, you need to tax £100 from somebody, right? That's the way that they're framing it. They're encouraging people to think about it. The issue is that if you actually do that, you're likely to tax the rich much less than what you actually need to actually have any meaningful impact on inequality. So inadvertently, that kind of limits the scope of what we can do to fight inequality, I think. And it's a matter of political strategy. But I do think it's foolish to link one action with the other objective. I think we should talk about both things, but separately.
Okay, so rather than talk about manifesto specifics for now, let's go with the Conservatives' ideological overview, which I would say Rishi Sunak recently nailed in one tweet a few days ago, which Dirk commented on. And the tweet goes like this: you, as in you, the public, you will always be better at spending your own money than the government is. What's your reaction to that, Dirk?
Well, I mean, that might be true. Who knows? But the problem is that your own money is a function of government spending. So when the government spends, it creates non-government income. And we are part of the non-government sector. Even if the government spends and pays money to the corporate sector, they employ people and they pay out wages. So it might still end up with us, with the households. So even if it's true that we will be better at spending our own money, I'm not sure whether it's true. But the government spends a lot of money on various things that we really need, like healthcare provisions in the NHS. They pay pensions and so on. So I'm not sure how we could privately spend our own money on pensions better than the government does. So it doesn't really make sense. I mean, this question never comes up. But anyway, I mean, macroeconomy, it's the interesting thing is that, as I said, the government spending creates income. And if you don't understand that, and if you think that you can reduce government spending, and then your idea is that this will mean less inefficiency in the economy, but by cutting government spending, you also cut non-government income. And we also spend out of government income. So that means that if the government cuts spending, we would cut spending. And then you would have a macroeconomic problem that you probably don't don't think about. And that means that you have a bad economy, that there's very little aggregate demand. So companies will lay off workers because they cannot sell the production, and we will get higher and higher unemployment. And once people are unemployed, they spend even less on consumption goods. So the whole thing is creating a vicious circle.
Yeah, I was just going to chip in and say this is what economists talk about when they say that we, the non-government, are going to act in a pro-cyclical way in that condition that you just outlined, where if you're a business and sales are going down, you don't think, oh God, I need to pump more money into the economy, so I'm going to spend more. You actually cut back and you shed staff and stuff like that. And so the point of having a public sector is, one of the points of having the public sector or a currency issuing government is you've got an entity there that can act counter-cyclically to stabilize the economy. And maybe you'd like to take it from there, Dirk. I know that in your book, you draw a parallel between how money flows through an economy and the game of Monopoly.
Yeah. I mean, in Monopoly, we have the bank, and the bank cannot run out of money. And then the players, they have their own kind of private sector interactions. So they pay rent, they buy those houses and streets and so on. And they also pass a Go field. And when you pass Go, you get some money from the bank. And that's like deficit spending, if you want. So the government spends money, but doesn't tax. There's a couple of events where you have to pay income tax, but normally the government or the bank in Monopoly spends more than it takes in taxes. And the whole game of Monopoly works because the government or the bank creates money. And that means in the monetary circuit of the Monopoly game, there's more and more money slushing about. If you would move to austerity rules and say, look, whenever you pass a Go field, the players have to pay the bank 1 unit of currency, then of course you can imagine what kind of turn that game would take. So people would not be optimistic and buy all kinds of real estate and create houses and hotels and so on. But instead they would think, oh, I know that kind of game. There's going to be less and less money. So the less I spend, the more possibilities I have to pay my bills. So what I will do is I will try to save more money, but saving more means not spending more. So it means spending less. But if I spend less money, I take away income from somebody else. And that means the game kind of collapses into a deflationary mode where nobody wants to buy real estate. Nobody wants to spend any money, and the game will be over with the winner being the only player who's not bankrupt. Okay. So that would be, I think, my lesson that I would take out of the Monopoly game if I would play with kind of MMT rules.
Can I bring something up actually? Because today there's been a lot of talk on Twitter about the interest rates that the Bank of England is paying on reserves, and therefore how much lenders are banks really are benefiting. I imagine it has to be for the same reasons that the Fed in America pays interest on reserves.
Yeah, it's the corridor system.
Yes.
Well, I guess it's now a floor system because there's excess reserves.
That's basically, correct me if I'm wrong, Dirk, but that's basically trying to narrow down control much more finally the interest rate that the banks charge each other.
Well, I mean, in the United States, the central bank, the Fed, they did not pay interest on reserves before the financial crisis happened. And that forced banks to buy government bonds. So government bonds had positive interest rates, and reserves that were just deposits at the central bank did not. When you create lots of reserves, the interest rate falls to zero if you don't pay interest on reserves. If you want to have a non-zero interest rate, you need to pay interest on reserves. And that's why the Fed introduced those.
Because of the course I'm studying, we had to do a little look at the Australian system because it's a little less arcane than, say, the American system. And I think they've embraced the excess reserves. They're moving to a regime of ample reserves. I think they quite like the idea of not having to constantly be estimating market demand for bonds and stuff like that just to hit their target interest rate. I think they like the ease of controlling the interest rate just by varying their support rate. What do they call it? The bank rate or the cash rate. The
ideal solution to all this would be to basically do what MMTs have been advocating for and dropped monetary policy as a means to control inflation, right? But I have a feeling that's not going to happen.
Yeah. And so in your book, you argue that a zero interest rate would transfer wealth from rich to poor. Could you just, if we haven't already done it, could you just outline how that would work? Because as it came up before, a common talking point you'll hear out there is that low and zero interest rates inflate asset prices, and that creates inequality. What's your take on all of that?
Well, the influence of the interest rate on the wider economy or in financial markets, I mean, it's mostly an empirical phenomenon. Okay, so in terms of theory, we have to explain what happens. So it doesn't really matter what our models say and what the models of central banks say. I mean, of course, you can have some kind of model which says that if you have a lower interest rate, then assets prices will be higher. And it's kind of easy to create such a model, and you will get some kind of mathematical equilibrium, and it's all going to use rational expectations and everything. But what we've seen in the real world was disappointing in the sense that in Japan, for example, they did a lot of QE and it didn't have a big effect on asset prices, I would think. And also in the 2010s, we had that in the US. We also had that in Europe, in the Eurozone, in Canada, and also in the United Kingdom. So I don't think that it works in that way. The big problem here is that banks are not stupid. So when banks are selling government bonds to the central banks, they get reserves. So what to do with those reserves? Of course, if you're a bank, you can invest in real estate, or you can invest in, say, Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies. But the problem is, if those investments turn out to be bad investments, then you have a problem as a bank because your assets go down. If everybody else has the same problem, it's okay. But I mean, if you invest into Bitcoin as a bank and the others don't, then you are bankrupt and the others are not bankrupt. And that just means that your bank will be closed. So the banks are moving in lockstep. So when they sell government bonds to the central banks, they get reserves. And they look at everybody else. So what are they doing with their reserves? If they're just hoarding reserves, just letting them rot in the account at the central bank where you get an interest rate, then nothing's going to happen. And that's the kind of logical conclusion. So banks normally exist for many decades and even centuries. And why do they exist for such a long time? Because they don't play games with their own balance sheet. Okay. So banks, in that sense, they are intermediaries when it comes to financial investment. So they play with other people's money, but not with their own money. Normally they understand that playing with your own money means that you are bankrupt when you have misjudged the situation and you end up with your assets depreciating to some extent that equity will be negative. So yeah, I don't think that quantitative easing is doing much. And I also think that low interest rates don't do much. So the real economy, those firms, they invest when they have lots of demand because they want to expand production. They want to produce more products and different kind of new products and spend money on research and development. So I think private investment is more a function of government spending and aggregate demand than it is a question of interest rates. Because, I mean, we have now higher interest rates in almost all economies. But in the United States, at high interest rates, you have private investment being up. It went down a little bit, but now it's up and it's staying up there. Whereas in the Eurozone, it went down. And I think that it's very clear that in the Eurozone, where government spending did not grow last year, roughly, that's the reason why firms don't invest. And in the United States, firms do invest because the Biden administration is spending lots of money on lots of different things and the companies want to sell to the government. So they need to invest themselves. So that's also one of the main ideas of MMT, that at the center of the economic universe, it's not the central bank planet with the interest rate, but it's the fiscal planet with government spending and tax revenues. That matters much more for the economy as a whole than the interest rates.
Yes, so we're kind of back to this. You need some entity in the economy to act counter-cyclically when things are going bad. And obviously the only unit that really can, if you're looking at the government versus the non-government, is the government. And I've been reading in the paper this week about Labour's posture on all of this. It's reported in the newspaper that Labour aim to secure the highest sustained growth in the G7 by adopting an approach called Securonomics. I think that was Rachel Reeves's title, or it's been called modern supply side economics, which apparently is what Bidenomics is as well. So Dirk, what is supply side economics and how is modern supply side economics different?
Well, I mean, supply-side economics is normally about the changes in productivity that you can get. So you want to increase productivity because then people have to work less and still get more output. So that's normally a nice situation. And that's what we had, especially in the 20th century. So the supply side normally is not about the macroeconomics. It's normally not about employment because when you increase productivity, what can happen in an economy is that you increase productivity. So the companies understand that they can produce the same amount as last year, but now they only need 80% of the workforce. So they just fire 20% of the workforce. So that would mean that higher productivity goes hand in hand with higher unemployment. So even Paul Samuelson, the godfather of modern economics, said that God gave the economist two eyes, one for the supply side and one for the demand side. So normally as an economist, you should watch both. But in the last couple of decades, there's more and more economists who basically say, well, the demand side really doesn't matter. If you want to have economic growth, you have to increase productivity. So we're back to those fallacies from 100 years ago. So there was this one British economist, John Maynard Keynes, who brought us back from the Great Depression by saying that we need to spend more money when we have unemployment. Nowadays, there's lots of people who think that unemployment is an individual problem and it can only be solved by supply side policies. The same with employment, because if you increase productivity, you have more international competitiveness and you will be able to export more, so you will have more employment. So these economists, they're kind of pretending that you can solve macroeconomic problems with supply side policy and supply side policy only. And I think that this is a huge mistake. They tried that in the Eurozone for 20 plus years. It doesn't work in theory. It doesn't work in practice. And I think we're moving back to the economics that we had before the Great Depression. So it's stuff that has been disproven many times. And just this noon, I found an article from James Tobin from 1974, where he basically says that it's not a good idea to use monetary policy to somehow create aggregate demand, which is proper for full employment. And I think he also talks about the fact that you cannot use the interest rate to fight inflation, that this is not a good idea. So to some extent, we haven't learned anything in 50 years. So we're still making these mistakes of thinking that somehow with the interest rate, we can influence price stability, we can influence the inflation rate, whereas government spending is much more important for both the rate of inflation, but also for employment.
When you say it goes back to how we used to think about the economy, do you mean to say, because there's something called Say's law, isn't it? That basically supply creates its own demand. How much of what we're seeing now is basically a return to following that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole neoclassical package. I mean, they're saying that having lower wages would increase employment, which is not true, because if you lower wages, then people will have less money. And if they have less income, they will spend less on consumption goods. So I think to some extent it's probably caused by your podcast. So probably you are so convincing that they have now gone back to all these kind of things that have been discredited. And I think this is only possible because they know it's wrong. Okay, so like 20 years ago, you could still say things like lower wages would probably increase employment, or a raise in the minimum wage will destroy employment. But by now, I think it's very clear empirically that those statements are wrong. So yeah, I think we have seen a change in the politics of that. Also in the German policy scene, we still have these old hardliners, you might also call them dinosaurs, who are arguing in those terms of neoclassical economics, but nobody really takes them seriously anymore. And I think it's probably the same in the United Kingdom. So we normally think as economists that these statements which are made in public are statements which should be true and that they're addressed to the public. But I think by now these statements are made to show that you are part of a tribe, okay? And that tribe is, I don't know, the Labour Party or something. And you issue those statements even though you know that they are wrong. But you know that you are part of the group. And if the Labour Party will have the next chancellor with Starmer, you know that you might get a position somewhere with the Labour Party, with the government, with the new government. And that's why you do it. So from a human perspective, it's completely rational to have human beings post wrong statements on Twitter, which are easy to dispel, but they don't do it to educate us or to talk about the way the economy works, but they want to have a position later on when the elections have basically brought in a Labour government. I think that's what they are for. And this is why you can see the frequency of these statements increasing right now. It has nothing to do with people who have now fallen in love with neoclassical economics.
Just in case anybody was thinking about approaching economics differently, I also read that Labour's economic approach will now involve bringing in tough fiscal rules with a new enhanced role for the Office for Budget Responsibility. and establishing even a further office called the Office for Value for Money to ensure that taxpayer cash is being well spent. And I put the quotes around taxpayer money, as you would expect as an MMT person. Patricia, I know you've got some feelings about the OBR and about its origins. Tell us about that.
The OBR was created in 2010 by David Cameron.
I think it was instituted while they were in opposition, and it was called something else. And then they moved it into government as well. So it was kind of maybe at the mid-noughties or late noughties, like you said on Twitter, Patricia, to keep the Labour government in line, basically.
Yeah, well, the official narrative is that we need an independent, in inverted commas, institution that makes sure that governments are responsible with fiscal policy. And of course, just because an institution is independent, it doesn't mean that it's free of ideology. And what they did is, as you know, neoliberalism kind of dresses itself in technical jargon to pretend that very political decisions are actually apolitical and just a matter of, as they say, responsible fiscal policy. And so it's amazing how quickly OBR is quoted, despite it not being that old, how I think it's only second to the IFS in terms of how every single policy proposal that any politician puts forward, you get the OBR's, view or the IFS's view. Or
part of the mythology around the Liz Truss quasi-Kwarteng debacle was that, well, they didn't get the all-knowing OBR to sign off on it, and that's part of the reason why everything went wrong for them.
Yeah, so it's basically saying it all needs to be done under this framework, and if you step out of that framework, you can't be a politician in the UK, effectively. And it's done to restrict policy, and it's done to ensure that even if a lefty government comes in, then that they are restricted in their scope by fiscal rules and all the stuff that we're seeing now. And
it's almost like having an economic Supreme Court.
Yeah, that pretends to be non-ideological, but actually is the most ideological thing you can have.
So, instead of kind of maybe calling that into question and maybe getting people to sort of look at its mandate and look at its articles of institution, the Labour Party are going, we need an extra OBR. We're going to open this Office for Value for Money. It's like, okay, so now we need two ideological Supreme Courts passing judgment on our fiscal policy.
The dangerous thing is that the BBC and the media haven't really picked up on that because they themselves subscribe to this notion of common sense. They frame the OBR as simply kind of enacting common sense in fiscal policy. And so they don't question, why are we judging things by this rule? Why is everything got to be, how are you going to pay for it? And the BBC's been told off in the past, for example, about using that kind of language and comparing government economics to household economics. It hasn't really mean much for them changing their tune. They're still talking in the same way.
So, look, in terms of, speaking of Liz Truss, Dirk, in terms of people worrying about certain policies leading to currency depreciation, which then leads to imported inflation, you, in your book, wrote about what happened to Iceland's exchange rate during their banking crisis in 2008. Are you able to talk about that?
Yeah. So Iceland was hit by a financial crisis just before the global financial crisis happened. They had these three banks, which were Icelandic, and they borrowed US dollars short. So that meant they borrowed US dollars for a day or for a month, maybe sometimes even for a year. And they bought long-term stuff with those dollars. So they bought, 20-year government bonds and bonds from private companies, which meant they always had to refinance. And if you have this kind of balance sheet where the liability side is kind of short-term and the asset side is kind of long-term, of course, it means that the long-term assets that you have on your asset side, they have a fixed exchange rate normally. So it's relatively fixed, everything. But if interest rates in the United States would go up, then of course your liabilities would be more and more costly. So to borrow money, you would have to pay a higher and higher interest rate. And that's exactly what happened. The United States, they increased the interest rate from roughly 2004 to roughly 2007 when the financial crisis happened. And the Icelandic banks were all bankrupted and the economy completely collapsed. And what happened then is that the Icelandic krona, so that's the Icelandic crown, their own currency, that dropped about 50% against the dollar and 50% against the euro as well. And normally you would say, oh, that's going to have horrible consequences, imported inflation, blah, 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 and you will go down in a downward spiral and your economy will explode. But nobody heard about the Icelandic explosion in the late 2000s, and that's because it never happened. So what happened was that the inflation rate, it briefly spiked at just under 20%, which given that you have a 50% depreciation is not that bad. And then it went back down again, and it was between 2 and 5%, like 2 years later already. And the unemployment rate came back down to 2 or 3%. And like 3 or 4 years after the banking crisis, the biggest problem in Iceland was that the economy was running hot and they had too much demand and they did not have enough workers. So what Iceland kind of shows is that if you have your own currency, it gives you another anti-cyclical tool, basically. So you can use it to increase demand in bad times. So of course, if the exchange rate goes down by 50%, it means that everything that you import from other countries will be very much expensive. And at the same time, everything that you consume at home is the same price. And if you want to sell it to a foreigner, the foreigner pays much less than before, well, half price in foreign currency. So that has helped actually. So this idea that a depreciation of the exchange rate is something which is bad and should be avoided. The example of Iceland shows us that it's more or less the opposite. So it's a good tool to have in times of economic crisis. And I mean, Iceland is a small, open economy. It's rather developed, that is true. But I would think that probably most other economies would follow the example of Iceland, given that they have no public debt in foreign currency. I think that would be a different thing. But in Iceland, only the banks had debt in US dollars, and the government said, we're not going to pay for that. I think I made a calculation once. If the Icelandic government would have bailed out the Icelandic banks, it would have come out at something like $50,000 per inhabitant as public debt in US dollars for the Icelandic government. And of course, that's not possible. So this includes babies and pensioners, and there's no way that Iceland could get that kind of money.
To get those babies into the workforce.
Yeah, I mean, they would have paid off that debt in the next century and a half, living on fish only.
We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Hey there, dear listener. Our sponsor for this episode of the MMT podcast is you, the listener, and we can't do it without you. And when I say it, I mean our aim to promote the best understanding that we can put together of how this thing called the economy actually works and how we can make it better. And we think a big part of that is knowing that better is possible and that many destructive policy choices are often sold to us by falsely equating the spending capacity of a government to that of a household. The way your government spends is nothing like the way a person or a household spends, because currency issuing governments are the source of their own spending money. Unemployment, underemployment, underfunded public health services, poverty, and many other things that politicians and pundits sell to us as sad but necessary are actually never necessary. Our money system has been mischaracterized in the media and academia for decades. An electorate that knows how it works can truly change things for the better and literally save lives. So we hope you can find it in your heart to support us via patreon.com/MMT podcast, because it really helps keep the show going and we want to make it bigger and better. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive back in. So maybe to turn the corner then, your chapter 6 in your book, Dirk, is all about MMT informed policy. Start anywhere. How would you be handling the UK right now?
Well, okay. I mean, probably the first thing I would do is I would reform the fiscal institutions, like your Office for Budget Responsibility. I would tell them, look, it's not that money is scarce, so there's no question how we pay for it. So can you please calculate whether we have the resources? And if the government wants to spend more on anything, can you calculate whether those resources can be made available without having an increase in price somewhere? So I would reform that, and I would scrap all fiscal rules and say, look, the government doesn't have any interest in overspending because that creates inefficiencies. And that means that the government uses resources and takes them away from the private sector, which means the private sector has less resources. So there will be shortages. There's something that they will not be able to produce because the government spent more money and has acquired those resources. And if the government makes a mistake there and prices go up, well, inflation is very unpopular with voters, especially with pensioners. Pensioners don't like it because they're on a fixed pension, and if prices go up, they're unhappy. So even if pensions go up afterwards, they're still unhappy. So I would think that there's really no incentive for the UK government to overspend in that sense, creating inflation and creating a public sector which is too large. Also empirically, I mean, if we look at Scandinavia, they have a larger public sector. They don't have any problem with inflation. They have strong currencies. They have nice welfare states, which are fairer and more equitable than probably the UK. I think that's the main thing. I would try to ask the Bank of England to move interest rates back down to zero. If that doesn't work, I would try to persuade the public that this is a good idea and somehow put public pressure on the Bank of England. And then, of course, there's a lot of other things that you could do. You could think about a job guarantee to shift the power more towards the workers and the unions. You can think about an industrial policy to increase industrial output, to have more good jobs, but also to have a green economy. So industrial policy would also be together, in my mind, with a Green New Deal, that you upgrade infrastructure, that you upgrade production processes. I can tell you from my football club, so I'm playing for a small football club here in Berlin. Next month, they will present their new shirt, and the shirt has been produced with materials that already have been used. If it lands on a landfill, it will just rot away. And if not, if it's recycled, all the components can move into the circular economy. So I think in Germany, it's going to be the first shirt that is a circular economy shirt. I mean, that means you will have to upgrade your machines and your skills and so on to produce these kind of things like a football shirt, which is sustainable. I mean, and then, of course, you have to address inequality and climate justice, which also belongs to the Green New Deal. And one thing that you could also do, which would probably help with the question, who gets what? And that's a kind of new thing that I added to the book. You could think about an economic bill of rights for the 21st century. It comes from FDR in the United States, this idea of an economic bill of rights. But that would ensure that everybody knows who's getting what. I think that is something which we also have to address. Many people are afraid of MMT because they think that government spending will be out of control, that the money will go to people who do not deserve it. So I think one way to address these kind of questions and problems is to have an economic bill of rights and say, okay, so you have a right to have affordable living. And here's a policy that we have from the government side to make that happen. And then be transparent about it. That would be nice changes to see in the UK. And I'm pretty sure that eventually we will see these kind of solutions, even though in the elections that are coming up now, there doesn't seem to be a lot of parties who are embracing those points.
Well, I was going to say Labour's manifesto, they talk about reducing waiting times for NHS. And there's a lot of things that on face value are quite positive. But what Dirk was talking about, the fiscal rules, I mean, their fiscal rule, just to be clear, is that the day-to-day spending has to be balanced. So they have to be met by revenues, and debt has to be falling as a share of the economy by the 5th year of the forecast. So it's a rolling basis requirement. Does that remind you of what was proposed on the Corbyn?
Exactly. Yeah. It's the same fiscal rule, isn't it?
Yeah, it is exactly the same. And it's interesting that of all Corbyn's policies, that's the one Stammer has kept. It has to say something about that policy. And that's the issue, is that very often, what if we have another pandemic or something of a similar scale and we have to have a huge increase in spending? You are potentially setting yourself up for failure there because there's an awful lot of that you do not control.
Yeah, but in emergency times, they can always get rid of the rules. I mean, they did that everywhere. So I think that's not the thing. But I mean, what I often hear is that, well, it's just politics. So he's just saying that, or the Labour Party is just saying that because they want to have more votes. But once they are in power, they will get rid of all these things.
But they say they're non-negotiable. At the beginning, they said the fiscal rules are non-negotiable.
Yeah, so it's definitely not happening. And I mean, in Germany, we have also a social democrat as chancellor. And the fiscal rules are fully enforced. The debt brake is on. It was not on in the years of crisis. So I think it's not just that they say it because it gets them more votes. They say it because they want to follow through.
Yeah, it can really limit the whole of their manifesto. Everything else in their manifesto, even the good stuff, it's subordinate to that fiscal rule, unless they can justify it as an emergency moment.
Just while we're talking about Labour pledging to improve the NHS, I noticed that they've said that's going to involve the government buying capacity from the private health system.
Okay, so more PFI.
So this country, we have trained medical professionals with public money generally, right? We then paywall their services within the private health system, and then we use more public money to pay the private healthcare system to release that back into the public sector. I'm thinking there's got to be a better way to go about this.
Yeah. What we want really is to renationalize the NHS, right?
Exactly, yeah.
We want less in the private sector, not to subsidize the private sector.
But then also, I was reading in nominally left-wing paper today, Keir Starmer will put economic growth and wealth creation at the heart of Labour's offer to voters as he launches a business-friendly manifesto targeted at former Conservative voters. So Starmer's not going for voters who are sick of Tories, of whom I'm told there are quite a few. Rather, he's going for people who are mad at the Tories for not being Tory enough, which is like, it's bold, I'll say that. So we were touching on the environment just then, and obviously that is the crisis of our time, right? That's the central crisis. In terms of trade policy, what do you make of the EU's up to 38% tariffs on Chinese EVs? Out of the States, it's 100% tariffs imposed in the US. So, Dirk, what do you make of that?
Well, I don't know where you got your numbers from, but I looked it up some time ago, and the old tariffs of the European Union were 10%, and now they want to add something, but it's sometimes individually. So companies like Build Your Dream, they would have to pay an extra 17%, which means total would be 27%. SAIC would have 38%, so that would take their total to 48%, almost 50%. And also German car makers who are producing in China would be hit, so their cars would also have higher rates, higher tariffs. Tesla seems to be negotiating with the European Commission. It's not clear yet what they will pay, but I think it's true that the Chinese are subsidizing the electric vehicles. And if we don't do anything in Europe, it means that these Chinese electric vehicles will be very cheap, and they're also very nice. So we're in danger of losing our own companies, which would not be a problem if we would know that the Chinese companies would take over our own companies and then start producing inside our own country. Because you're in the United Kingdom, it already happened to you. Okay, so you have lots of car factories in the UK. I think the United Kingdom is the fourth largest automobile producer in Europe. But it's mostly foreign brands. It's Japanese car makers, German car makers. So it's not a problem. I mean, it's okay to have foreign-owned companies producing cars in your own country. In Germany, we have the same. We have General Motors with Opel. I mean, they sold it by now, but we still have Ford factory, which is kind of close to Cologne. So for the economy as a whole, the important thing is that the manufacturing jobs are there. Whether it's a foreign company or a domestic company, I mean, it makes a little bit of a difference because of the profits, but not too much. And I would really be in favor of having protection against cheap Chinese cars, because otherwise what could happen is that we will replace EVs produced in Europe with Chinese imports, and that destroys our employment. And once the automobile sector is destroyed and the companies are bankrupt and the workers are displaced and everything's gone, you cannot rebuild that. I mean, we normally think about the economy and factors of production as very abstract things like capital and human capital. It really links together, so it's specific. So certain workers can use certain machines, and if you take out the workers and you destroy the machines or you sell them off because the company goes bankrupt, you cannot bring it back. Okay, so that's a problem. And this is why the Americans also saved their automobile industry during the global financial crisis. It was a very good idea because otherwise they would have lost all those manufacturing jobs. And in the 2000s, they already lost 1 out of 3 jobs in manufacturing in the United States, creating the potential for these Make America Great Again people, because the working class has a problem to find properly paid jobs. And it's the same here. So, I mean, rich countries in Europe are rich because they have high paid jobs. And I know that the city of London has lots of highly paid bankers, but other countries like Germany or even France and parts of England as well, most people who have a good income, they work in the manufacturing sector. And that's why I think it is a good idea to have these tariffs and to come to terms with the Chinese about market shares and maybe import quotas and the like, because otherwise the Chinese are dumping their products here and they just destroy employment. And I mean, in an ideal world, Warren Mosler would say, well, let the government spend more money, and then these people who are unemployed would be employed. Problem solved. Yes. Theoretically, yes. But I mean, that's not how our economies work right now. This is not how our economic policy making works. So in the world that we're living in, I would think that tariffs to protect our industries against EVs from China right now are a very good idea.
Right. Is there a halfway house between, say, Warren's view of, okay, well, it's probably a good idea to have EVs be as cheap as possible and reach as many people as possible? Why make them more expensive than they need to be? Therefore, go with China and use that capacity that's been freed up for the next problem. I know that makes a lot of sense.
But even Warren will talk about security decisions with regards to industries. I think, for example, the steel industry in the UK is being completely dismantled, and a lot of that had to do with cheap steel coming from China as well. But is our policy to have this free trade, not to impose tariffs? It's our fault. I don't want to frame it the way that a lot of people frame it as, oh, this is China's fault.
Absolutely, yeah.
And no, we're perfectly within a capacity to deal with this and to protect our own industries, or to even subsidize them if needs be. But we've chosen not to. And the Port Talbot steel factory in Wales is being shut down. It's quite close to me because I used to work there actually as a student. And now the danger is we're losing the knowledge on how to run this machinery, how to produce all this stuff. So if, God forbid, something happens and we need to supply our own goods, God forbid, say, worst case scenario, a war happens again and we need weaponry and we have no means of producing steel because we have forgotten how to do that. That's a security issue, arguably. And I think the EV car thing is probably quite similar to that. Funny enough, I just bought an EV car from China.
Okay.
So I'm sorry.
Right. We found the traitor in our midst.
But yeah, Dirk, you're absolutely right. So it'd be interesting to see how they deal with that, because I think that kind of animosity towards China is going to increase.
So speaking of all this productivity and freed up capacity, in your book, you are advocating for a shorter working week, which I'm sure many people listening can get behind. And in fact, as part of the UK Green Party's manifesto, they're advocating a 4-day week. Tell us about that, and what would you say to somebody who felt that idea was utopian?
I think we come from a situation like 120 years back where everybody was working 10 hours a day and then only Sundays were off. So we had basically 60 hours work weeks, and that's only 125 years ago. So we cut down working hours and now we are at roughly 40 hours a week. And that was a result of having higher productivity and people wanting more leisure time. And this kind of trend of cutting working hours, it stopped in the 1970s, 1980s. And if we look at the ecological situation, it's clear that we are consuming too much. And one way to consume less is to produce less. So if we work 1 day less, it means that output would go down roughly by 20%. I mean, where you have increasing returns to scale, it's doubtful. But anyway, let's just assume that on average it's somewhere between 15 or 20%. And then we have more time to spend. Of course, we have to make sure that in this time that we can spend now as leisure time, that we don't consume more. So that would not be possible. But there's a lot of things that would help us, I guess. So we would have more time for family, for friends. We would have probably also time to engage in politics and maybe activism, or to use more time for education, culture also, or travel somewhere, hopefully with a bicycle or something else, which takes very little resources.
Or a Chinese electric vehicle.
Yeah.
Well, there is a growth imperative in capitalism, right? That requires us to consume more and more. How would you deal with that?
Well, I'm not happy with the word growth imperative, because the economy is not aware. It's not a living being, and it cannot decide anything. Okay. So it's a network. Okay. It's a system. It's a little bit like a computer. The computer can only do what its parts tell the computer to do. So there's no 0-1 imperative for a computer, for example.
We set the imperatives, right?
I mean, yes, firms should grow if they want to succeed. And if they don't grow, they go down. So yes, growth is kind of hardwired into the system, but not at the system level, but at the local level. So it's about firms who are borrowing money from financial markets and banks, and then they produce and they sell, and hopefully they have a profit, and then they can pay interest out of that profit. It's old stuff. It was in Marx, it was in Wicksell, it was in Schumpeter. So I don't know what the growth imperative is somehow adding to the whole picture. So yeah, you can have economies, for example, like those of Greece, where GDP today is more than 20% lower than it was in 2007. Does it mean that somehow in Greece capitalism changed, or that somehow the people are better off in Greece now? I don't think so. Okay, so I do agree that we need to cut down consumption, but I don't think that the main cause of this capitalist crisis, if you want, is that the companies are producing all that stuff. But the main cause for the companies producing all that stuff, and now I flash my Keynesian card, is because we demand that stuff. So demand drives supply. If we would demand less stuff, then less stuff would be produced. So it's us. So we are at fault. And I think the growth imperative story is blaming capitalism as a system. Maybe politically this works better than blaming us ourselves. But I think it's not right from a scientific point of view. So yeah, I mean, that's why I hope that cutting working hours means that there's going to be less supply, because also in those hours that we spend in a different way, we don't demand these goods and services that otherwise we might demand. Also to compensate us for the displeasure of work that probably most of us still experience.
The Greens would also be pushing for a £15 an hour minimum wage over here. And we have talked about over many episodes the modern money theory job guarantee. Dirk, would you be comfortable talking about how those two things might go together? You know, a shorter working week, a minimum wage. How might that all work together under an MMT job guarantee?
Well, if we would have a federal job guarantee, then the government at the local level would offer a wide range of jobs, which are proper for those who are looking for work, taking also into account education and age, and also whether people would like to work 40 hours a week or maybe 20 or maybe 30 or 35. That's up to them. The job guarantee would, of course, it would empower workers, and there would be less pressure to take up those bullshit jobs, as David Graeber called them, which pay very little and also achieve very little. In terms of the ecological perspective, I mean, probably many of these job guarantee jobs can be green jobs. Okay, so you might have jobs where people learn how to plant trees, and then these people move through the city planting trees, which doesn't stop climate change, but it kind of helps with providing us with more shade. So sometimes small things matter. I mean, we cannot stop climate change right now. I mean, it's going to be hotter and hotter in the next couple of decades. So even if we would stop to have any CO2 emissions now, it would still be warmer. But I mean, the employment situation would improve, and the job guarantee wage would act as a minimum wage. And if you increase that every year, you probably can also drive the inflation rate and target that. So if the inflation target of the United Kingdom is 2%, why not increase job guarantee wages by 2% every year? Why not increase public sector job wages by 2% every year as well, to make sure that the difference between those jobs and the job guarantee is still the same? It would go a long way towards price stability, I guess. So yeah, all of these things are interconnected, and the job guarantee, I think, would be a very nice tool for the Green Party of the UK to reach price stability, to reach full employment, but also to green the economy.
I just wanted to touch on one more thing before we round it off. The Liberal Democrats, the big thing the Lib Dems are nailing their colours to the mast with is a promise to fix the UK's broken relationship with Europe, which would include a pledge to seek to rejoin the single market with a longer-term objective of rejoining the EU. Putting aside what Lib Dem pledges might be worth, at the Poznan MMT Summer School, Dirk, which me and Patricia can heartily recommend because we went to it and loved it, this year I see that you're speaking on what entering into the EU's Growth and Stability Pact would mean for, say, Scotland, if I've read that right. So I wondered what you make of the Lib Dems' position of being the party that will have the UK back in the EU ultimately.
I think there's a difference between the European Union and the Eurozone. So the special thing about the Scottish case is that one of their policymakers said that if Scotland becomes independent, they will very quickly adhere to the Stability and Growth Pact, even if they don't have to, because they're not yet in the European Union.
I did not know that, right.
So I checked the numbers, drawing up the sectoral balances for Scotland, and then kind of using scenario analysis to see what kind of public deficits you can expect from Scotland in the next 10 or 15 years. And I found that if you use the average growth rate of Scotland over the 2010s, not including the pandemic, you still get a public deficit which is roughly between 9 and 10% of GDP.
Which is too high.
So I think in order to reach 3% or lower, you would have to have a simultaneous export boom and also a private investment boom. So basically, I'm talking about a real estate bubble. You would have to have both those things at the same time in order for Scotland to be able to fulfill the Maastricht criteria and the 3% deficit limits in the Stability and Growth Pact. First of all, it's very unlikely to happen because Scotland, if they do export energy, and not much more, by the way. So if energy prices go up, then that could work out. But the real estate boom, of course, is self-defeating. So normally what goes up comes down. So they could only fulfill the Maastricht criteria with the 3% deficit limit in good times during the boom. But during a possible real estate crisis, the deficit would balloon to probably double digits again. And it would take many years for it to go back down again. So the idea of Scotland joining the European Union later and having the Stability and Growth Pact in place already, that is something which from an economic point of view should not be done. It's not realistic. So yeah, it was interesting because I was using a model that I created in 2014, a macroeconomic model which is based on MMT. So it's kind of stock flow consistent, I would think. I model only the flows explicitly, but of course, in an Excel spreadsheet, if you add up the flows, you have the stock. And then, of course, you can come up with initial numbers and then you have a very realistic model. So that was very interesting to see how that works. And if I use a zero growth scenario, so talking about the Green Party and ecological things. So if I use a zero growth scenario, then the public deficit would be more than 10% all of the time. And yeah, it would be stable, but at definitely more than 10% of GDP. So the worst case scenario is hopeless, and the best case scenario of having the same growth rate as in the 2010s is the optimistic scenario is also hopeless because it really doesn't matter whether you have 9% of GDP as a public deficit or 10. It would mean that the European Commission would ask you to cut government spending by billions of whatever currency you're using then. So yeah, I think that's the outcome of the model, and I'm going to present the details at the MMT Summer School in Poznan. Glad you brought it up. It's going to be a lot of fun, I guess.
That's really interesting because they always say that as long as Scotland doesn't join the euro, then it's not a problem. But actually I read it a few years back. If it's still the same, the requirement to join the EU is to work towards the euro. And working towards the euro means exactly what you've just described, isn't it? Abiding by the rules despite not having the currency.
Yeah, and the Stability and Growth Pact is a European Union law. It applies to everybody. It doesn't matter whether you have the euro or not. That would be the problem for countries which have their own currency and access the European Union. And yes, but the countries that are now accessing the European Union, I think Croatia joined, 2022, the euro, not the European Union. But those countries that join, they are supposed to switch to the euro at some point. But the wording is very vague, so there's no automatism. So if you want to stay out of the euro, you can. And countries like Sweden or Denmark, they stayed out of the euro in 2000, and they are still out, and they probably will not join in the near future.
Yeah, that's really worrying because, one could argue that the UK, when the UK was inside, that the words that the UK was send us a really strong worded letter about breaking these rules. And it put political pressure on our politicians. I'm not going to say that it was completely useless. It did have some impact. But if Scotland joins on its own, it would be a much smaller economy than Britain as a whole, and perhaps much more easily kind of coerced into following these rules.
Yeah, if you look what happened to Ireland, which was forced by the ECB and the political establishment in Europe to bail out their banking system. And Ireland is larger than Scotland, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of GDP. So yeah, it's a risk, but the good news is that, the history is history. And Alberto Alesina, the architect of austerity, he died a couple of years ago. Wolfgang Schäuble, the political architect of austerity, died last year, if I'm not mistaken. And whenever people mention the word austerity, there's normally 90% of the people don't like it. Okay, so I think that even though there's a lot of political posturing about austerity, I think that times of austerity are over. And When they cut government spending in Germany last year in the budget, they said they do it because they want to have lower rates of inflation. It was not about running out of money and bringing down public debt. And they were not talking about public debt sustainability, which was the austerity talk. So I think we kind of done with the austerity thing, if I'm not mistaken. And now it's different reasons.
So the advice is still the same, though, isn't it? In a way, the advice is just beware fiscal straitjackets that you maybe don't need. Like if you're looking at your independent nation going into, a currency union or a single market, drill down into the details. Are you swapping one fiscal straitjacket for another?
Yeah, I mean, the theoretical reason is a different one. I mean, these people, they said you can bring down public debt and grow faster if you cut government spending. That was the austerity thing. And now they're coming up with other reasons. They say, well, we're going to go bankrupt, which is what the IMF is saying currently. The IMF says basically the US has fiscal problems. They have to bring down public debt. They don't really say it, but implicitly you can see between the lines that they basically say, well, you're going to run out of money. You're going to go bankrupt. And then there's this very nice trailer for Finding the Money, the documentary, where the top economic advisor of Joe Biden, Bernstein, he literally says the US cannot go bankrupt because we print our own money. That's what he says. Okay, so here you have the top economic advisor of Joe Biden saying that the US government cannot go bankrupt. I mean, he talks about printing money, which is not correct, of course, and he can't explain it. So when you watch the clip, you have Stephanie Carlton who kind of sets him straight. Yeah, but I mean, the arguments are always changing. This has happened in economics all of the time, but the austerity thing seems to be rather dead. And now it's going to be easier for us to fight the other arguments. And I think we're kind of close to winning, I guess, because what Biden's economic advisor has said, that's straight out of MMT, that the US government cannot run out of money. What else do you want to hear from a US top economic advisor?
So just to round off, Dirk, I'm going to pull a quote from your book. The discussion about the right economic policy that we should have had in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 crisis is really just beginning. The polycrises we're seeing now are the result of not having had that debate earlier. What should the poles of that debate be?
Yeah, the first point we already talked about is resources should be used in a sustainable way, and we should address climate change as soon as possible. That's one important factor. And the second is to get rid of this idea that fiscal deficits somehow have a meaning, that there is something like fiscal space. The way the mainstream defines it. So yes, there are resources which are available for production. If you want to call that fiscal space, then that's absolutely okay. But our politicians, our policymakers, they should be thinking about how to fix the deficits in our societies, in our communities. And they should not think in terms of spending money as a cost to the government, but they should only think about the resources and how to spend that money with macroeconomic results also being achieved, like price stability, full employment. The third dimension would be, I think John Maynard Keynes noted that about a century ago, that the market system does not generate a fair and equitable distribution of income and wealth. That's still true. So if you just leave everything to the market, then the rich will be getting richer, and those who are CEOs, their income by now is like 400-fold the income of a worker. It used to be 20 times that income, and it will go on. So we have to think about institutions to ensure that the distribution situation, it's already gotten out of hand. And we talked about wealth taxes and so on. But democracy cannot work when you have this kind of high inequality of income and wealth. And that should be the main reason why we should think about distribution. And connected to that, we have to talk about the way that economics is taught. This focus on self-interest that we have, that's damaging for our societies. So we are a cooperative species, mostly. But the theory that we teach at universities, think about microeconomics and so on, it just assumes that we are heartless maximizers of our own utility. And that's not true. So it's now a human nature to help others. Same with animals, by the way. So if animals see that another animal, a fellow animal, is stressed by something, they approach that animal. They don't run away. Biologists have been recognizing this in all the species that they've looked at. And same with human beings. So we are social animals. It is in our human nature to help others. That means that this kind of economics that we're teaching at most mainstream universities, it's not the right software for the hardware that we have, if you want. And of course, I have to bring up Samuel Pufendorf, a philosopher from the 17th century. And he recognized that there's self-interest, which is human nature. It's one of the driving forces, which is pulling us apart. Because if I want to be number one, I'm very competitive. I'm fighting everybody else. But Pufendorf said, well, if there's only self-interest, we would not be friends and we would have a winner and we would not have a social life, because the winner would basically beat everybody else. And probably that would mean that everybody else is dead. And he's talking about the 17th century. The losers don't want to hang out with the winner and the winner doesn't want to hang out with the losers. So there must be something else. And he called the other driving force of human beings, he called that sociability. So we like to spend time in the company of others. And even if you're number one, you like to be admired by the others for being number one. Even if you're a nice guy, think about Roger Federer, the tennis player, for example. So sociability is nothing bad. It's also hardwired in us. And that also means then this fixation on consumption is not a good idea. Consumption is not the goal. So the textbooks in economics assume that consumption increases happiness, but I think it's wrong. We consume to increase social rank, social position, to join groups and stay within those groups once we've joined them. So the happiness comes from being with others, not from the consumption itself. And that's why I think that the economics that is still taught at universities worldwide is dangerous, because their view of human nature is wrong. And that means the policy conclusions that they have, they won't be working with us, because human beings are not as they think they are. In order to flourish, we need support from society and each other. We don't need austerity. That's the way to make people angry and to turn people into violent beings, because they are left alone. They are unhappy. They don't have the resources that they need.
To be clear, this view of human nature is not like economists in the mainstream have asked sociologists or other academics about, or psychologists about how humans operate. This is a quasi-religious view of human nature. Is almost like what's the meaning, defining the meaning of life as all about me.
Yeah, I mean, the Homo economicus, which is the special term that economists use for that, this Homo economicus is like a computer who has no friends, no social connections. There's no tradition. The individual is always flexible, so you go wherever real wages are highest. I mean, it's okay to use this to think about certain things, but to have this as the only kind of view on human nature, as a rational somehow being. I'm always saying that if you have a being which is rational, so like us, so yes, humans are rational, but you cannot be rational without having feelings. So you have to express feelings in order to be rational. So, for example, if it would be irrational to put your hand on the stove, for example, which is at 100 degrees, you would burn yourself. So it hurts you. So feelings are the basis of everything. And it's kind of strange to have in economics where you have no feelings, but you have rationality. But rationality without feelings is completely empty. So the problem with economics, classical economics, I think it starts with the way that the Homo economicus is presented as something which is somehow describing or explaining the human being. It is definitely not. And I think this is where we should also work to improve things, to have a better view about who we are and what human nature is, and to get to know us better. Other disciplines have made a lot of advantages and discoveries in the last couple of years, like neurosciences, but also biology. There's lots of very interesting papers about us, for example, rationalizing decisions after our body has already started to move, which is fascinating. So I think we should embrace all of that and get rid of the Homo economicus.
I think George Lakoff said that emotions, feelings are part of rationality. Without them, you don't really know what to want.
Absolutely.
And that's a great place to leave it. We've been speaking to Dr. Dirk Entz. I'll link to where you can stay current with Dirk and order his new book in the show notes for this episode, along with, because let me just emphasize, most of politics happens between elections. So we're looking to change the economic paradigm and change the conversation in the meantime so that we have better options next time around. So with that in mind, I'll also link to where you can find out more about Dirk's MMT and European Macroeconomics course at Maastricht University, which runs for a week starting on the 19th of August. But the application deadline for that is the 19th of July, so don't miss out on that. Before that, though, Dirk will be speaking at the first UK MMT conference at Leeds University, which is very exciting. It runs from July the 15th to July the 17th. And it will also feature all the first generation developers of MMT, including Stephanie Kelton, Warren Mosler, Bill Mitchell, L. Randall Way, Pavlina Chernova, and more. At the time of recording, there are only a tiny handful of tickets left, so snap any of those up if there are any left by the time you're hearing this. Dirk is also going to be teaching at the Lipinski Foundation's highly recommended MMT Summer School in Poznan, Poland from August the 27th to the 29th. And he'll also be at the 4th International European MMT Conference, which takes place in Berlin on the 31st of August and the 1st of September. If you want to take your understanding of MMT and real-world economics to the next level, Modern Money Lab is running online graduate and postgraduate courses taught by the cream of MMT lecturers, including Dirk. Long-time listeners will know many of the other instructors from our shows. They are fantastic at what they do. I'll link to all of the above in the show notes, where, as ever, for our Patreon subscribers, there'll be a link to all of our patron-only episodes, so there's lots of extras there for you to unlock as well. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Dr. Dirk Entz.
Thanks, Christian, and thanks, Patricia. It was a pleasure to be here.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.